Today I want to talk about a couple of books I'm reading and what they have to teach us about the time we live in now and our deep need for community. Stay tuned. Hello, friends. Pastor Tim Westermeyer here, Senior Pastor of St. Philip the Deacon in the western suburbs of Minneapolis. Good to be with you as always. I want to pick up, first of all, or connect my opening remarks here with last week's episode, which was about the gift of community, and I was reflecting on some wonderful conversations I'd had over the course of a week of the week with a number of members from St. Philip the Deacon. Turns out that has continued this week. In the case of this week, two of those conversations were actually connected to Pastor Michaela Darlene's sermon from the past weekend, and maybe we'll link to that. We were focusing on baptism. So I met with a couple of people who wanted to ask some questions about baptism for their own children, and I wanted sort of just to say thank you for those conversations, and also to just say it strikes me that's a beautiful kind of reminder of how the church works, right? We come to worship on Sunday, we hear a message, it prompts questions for us, and then we continue the conversation through the week. I just love that, and I was delighted, again, to have those discussions. So thank you for those conversations. I always thoroughly enjoy them, and I look forward to many more with any of you who may want to come and visit me or the other pastors to talk about issues of faith or how faith impacts everyday life or anything else. That got me thinking, again, that last week it was about the gift of community. That was the subject. And I was reflecting this week on another kind of community, let's call it, which is the community of authors, people who write things that allow us to read and learn. And in fact, one of the conversations I had this week, the person came into my office and my walls are surrounded by books and bookshelves, which are among my most prized possessions, and he actually commented on them. And so I thought I would lift up a couple of books that I'm reading right now. But I want to preface them with a comment or a thought from C.S. Lewis. And this is, I guess, related to the gift of community again. And this is the community of the Christian church over time. And it's a reminder that we are invited to learn from the wisdom of those who have gone before us as a way of preventing us from missing some of the blind spots of our own time. And he makes this point, and I would commend this introduction to you I've got, I guess it's the first edition of this book. It's actually not by Lewis, but again, he wrote the introductions. It's a translation of a very old book indeed by Athanasius, Saint Athanasius, who lived in the 300s. The book is called The Incarnation of the Word of God. It was translated actually by a British nun who C.S. Lewis got to know. And in this introduction, again, he's saying, if you have to pick whether to read a modern or new book or an old book, he said, on balance, I'd encourage you to pick an old book. And I'm not going to read the whole introduction, which, by the way, also has the line Mere Christianity in it a couple of times before the book Mere Christianity was published. So that's interesting. But he says this, among other things. He says, every age has its own outlook. It is specially good at seeing certain truths and specially liable to make certain mistakes. We all therefore need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period. And that means the old books. And so, again, I'm advocating here for reading older books. I'm going to lift up two books here. One is older, although not as old as the 300s. This is by Flannery O'Connor. It's a collection of short stories called Everything That Rises Must Converge. To give you a sense of my emotional connections to my books, this belongs on a very specific place on my bookshelf, and it was not there when I was looking for it earlier this week, and that was deeply troubling to me. And thankfully, I found it in another pile of books that is at my house, which was a big relief to me. Anyway, I'd commend the introduction of this book. Also, the introduction is by a friend of hers, Robert Fitzgerald. I think that's the name. Robert Fitzgerald. And the introduction's a wonderful summary of her life and her work and her genius. But I would also really commend one short story particularly. It's called Revelation. It's on page 191 of this collection. It's just brilliant. And so I'm delighted to have found that and I'm reading it again. That's the older book that would have been published in the middle of the 20th century, mid to late 20th century. The other book I'm reading is a new book to me by one of the justices of the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett. And I sort of stumbled onto some interviews with her on YouTube. She was on effectively, I guess, a book tour announcing the publication of this. So she has just recently, in the last week or two, done a number of interviews. You could find them very easily. And this book, it's called Listening to the Law, Reflections on the Court and Constitution, is her attempt to sort of help people understand how does the Supreme Court specifically and the judicial system more particularly work. Now, I'm a pastor, and so most of the reading I do, I would say, is along the lines of religion and theology and history and philosophy, which I love. But I also like to read other things just that are outside of my area of professional expertise, just because I find them interesting. And I have certainly found her reflections in those interviews, and I'm not done with this book. I've just started it, but I've found the beginning of this book very interesting as well. And I'm going to lift up one reflection, I guess, from it. This is from chapter 3, and it's the title of chapter 3 is called Working Together. And this is all about one of the questions she's gotten since she joined the court, I think that would have been in 2020, is do the justices get along? Is there collegiality among the justices of the bench? And this chapter is all sort of reflecting on that. And the answer, she would say, is yes, absolutely. And we work really hard at it because, as she explains, being a justice of the Supreme Court is a little like it being an arranged marriage. They didn't ask her to be there, and now here she is, and they're going to work together for a very long time. So if there are disagreements or challenges personally, that is really hard to sustain. So they have traditions in the Supreme Court to help make sure that they have they can work together easily and well, even if they disagree. And so I'm just going to lift up a couple of quotes from this, which strike me as appropriate not only for justices of the Supreme Court, but maybe for all of us who live in a contentious and polarized time. One thing, she says, is the possibility of dissent remains a centuries-old feature, not a flaw of the court's deliberative process. And when handled well, disagreement is a source of strength rather than a reason for regret. I'm going to say that again. Disagreement is a source of strength rather than a reason for regret. I wonder how often in our culture we think of disagreement as a source of strength. And I wonder if we could reframe that and be able to disagree without being disagreeable, if we would all be in a better place. She lifts up a couple of examples of precisely individuals who have disagreed profoundly and yet stayed very close friends. One of those is Justice Anthony Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who famously disagreed about just about everything, but also were incredibly close friends. The other more historic example she lifts up is Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, who also, again, began as friends that had a huge falling out. They didn't talk to each other for, I think, more than a decade. And then they came back together. And Jefferson ends up, they ended up becoming dear friends before the end of their life. They both died poetically on July 4th in the same year. But he, in a letter to Adams, he said, it's dawned on me this truth, that opinions which are equally honest on both sides should not affect personal esteem or social intercourse. And then the Justice Barrett ends the chapter by saying this, and I'll conclude this episode with this reflection again on our capacity to have relationships with people who disagree with us and how critically important that is for our culture today. She said, all human relationships depend on kindness and humility. True, relationships in the court sometimes operate under the stress of disagreement about issues of immense importance, but that, to my mind, heightens the importance of collegiality. The success of a multi-member court rides on the ability to disagree respectfully. The success of a democratic society does too. I would be interested to know what you're reading these days. I hope you found those two sources interesting and helpful. And until next time, as always, be well, stay in touch, and God bless.